Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining DataCon LA 2020. Welcome to the Data for Good track, and soon we'll be listening to the Applying an Intersectionality Lens in Data Science with Daphne Chang and Rachel Whaley. I'm Annie Flippo, your host, and our co-host today is Ritesh Dediya, and we'll be moderating the chat and Q&A for the duration of the session. Daphne Chang is a data scientist at the Walt Disney Company, working on predictive network and infrastructure and analytics. She has volunteered as an analytics lead for Women at Disney, advancing women and talent mobility within Disney, and is currently a volunteer for LA Tech for Good. And Rachel Whaley is a database manager at the University of Southern California, building data and data analytics tools to support student success. She's passionate about using technology to enable positive social impact through her volunteer work with LA Tech for Good and Hack for LA. And without further ado, I'll hand over this to the speakers. Thanks for being here. Here are Daphne and Rachel.
Thank you so much. All right. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our session this afternoon on applying an intersectionality lens in data science. First, we wanted to introduce ourselves. My name is Rachel Whaley, and my background is in social impact technology. I'm really passionate about this topic because after seeing so many examples of bias in technology and data, I believe that if more data folks can adopt an intersectionality perspective to fight bias and fight injustice, that we can all make the world a better place.
And my name is Daphne Chung. I am currently a data scientist at the Walt Disney Company, specifically in network services, where I use data to enhance connectivity between technological capabilities across the enterprise. Most of my applications of intersectionality in data have actually been in my volunteer work with Women at Disney, where I've used data to research and understand talent mobility and how we can create more opportunities for women within the company. Rachel and I also happen to be LA Tech for Good volunteers, where we provide thought leadership around critical topics where technology and social impact intersect.
So we have two objectives for our session today. The first is to help you understand what intersectionality is and why it matters in data science. And the second is to provide tactical tools that you could use to apply this intersectionality perspective to your work after the session. So in order to do that, we're going to start with a definition. What is intersectionality? Then we're going to get into what it looks like to apply an intersectionality lens. Then we'll introduce you to our persona, Jessica, who will walk us through a sample data science project and how intersectionality applies to each phase of the project lifecycle. And at the end, we'll wrap up with action items, so tactical things that you can take away to start using this perspective in your work. So to start with a definition, what is intersectionality? So for this, we would love to get a little bit of participation in the chat. So we would love to know on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you with intersectionality? So 1 would be, this is one of the first times you're hearing about it, you don't know a lot. And 10 would be, you're super comfortable, you've maybe even used this in your work before. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are folks with intersectionality? We'd love to see a few numbers in the chat so we can get a feel for where we're at. All right, seeing a few folks who are pretty comfortable. That's great. Awesome. So if you're a little bit newer to the concept of intersectionality, it's helpful to think of it as a Venn diagram, where each circle in the Venn diagram is an aspect of a person's identity. So these attributes could include factors such as race, ethnicity, gender identity, ability status, age. There's lots of examples. We've included a few examples on the screen, but there are many more. So we have an example here of a Venn diagram. And this is a Latinx woman who's a college graduate. So you can think about where the circles overlap, and this is where intersecting identities come into play. So her identities as a female college graduate, or as a Latinx college graduate, or as all three of those things in different contexts may affect how she experiences the world and how the world experiences her. So you could start to imagine how your own Venn diagram might look, some different attributes of your own identity, each in their own circles and all overlapping together to kind of create a fuller picture of your identity. So that's the basic concept of intersectionality. So how do we start to apply this to our work? To answer that, we want to understand where intersectionality comes from. So there's a scholar in critical race theory named Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a Black woman who coined this term. And it comes from her research and analysis of a variety of legal cases. And these are cases where she identified a pattern in discrimination against intersectional identities. So this is where a company may not be discriminating against all its female employees, or it may not be discriminating against all Black employees, and yet the company could be discriminating specifically against, say, Black female employees. And so this is where a person's intersectional identity and these layers of discrimination that may exist for those identities can compound to create greater obstacles and greater injustices for some individuals. And so what does this mean for data science? To answer that, I'd like to share a quote from this article on the history of intersectionality. Intersectionality operates as both the observance and analysis of power imbalances, and the tool by which those power imbalances could be eliminated altogether. So that's from Jane Coaston. And I like this quote because it talks about the three ways that intersectionality can be used. So it can be used as a tool to observe power dynamics that are going on between identity groups. It can be used to analyze the impacts of those imbalances on different intersectional identity groups. And finally, it can actually be used to address some of those imbalances. So that's where we're talking about using this as a tool to really eliminate injustices that we're able to see through this lens. So let's talk a little bit about how those three pieces fit into our data science process. So we're going to get into the actual data science project lifecycle in a moment. But before we do that, we want to kind of bookend that process with some important before and after steps. So this first bookend we want to talk about is awareness. So this is developing some self-awareness, so thinking about your own Venn diagram and reflecting on your own identity, as well as understanding various other identity groups and how those might intersect on your team, for example. And this also includes understanding and learning tools to address unconscious bias. So we're going to talk more specifically about tools on how to do this in our action steps at the end, but this is the first place we want to start. And the reason that awareness is so important is because it allows you to see different things that might be going on in your data. So for example, if you don't identify as particularly religious and you haven't done some of this awareness work at the beginning, you might have data in your project that's affected by that. So for example, if the data in your project is collected at a certain point in time, you might not have considered that it could have been during a major religious holiday that might have affected some of your audience's behavior or your users' behavior that could impact your project. So that's awareness, that's the first step. The second bookend before we get into the project is unpacking assumptions. So even before you get into your project, you want to start to identify and address the assumptions that are kind of underlying your work in whatever your context may be. So for example, a common assumption might be that your project you're working on is gender neutral. Gender is not really relevant to what you're working on, so you're not looking at gender data. And that's a great assumption to unpack. Is that really true? Have you looked at your user data and found that there's no important differences in behavior between different gender groups in your data? So this is a really important one to look at, and other factors too, of course, but can start to appear where you might not expect. So that's why it's important to really look at those assumptions. Then we'll get into the whole life cycle. We'll do that in a moment. And this last kind of bookend on the other side of your life cycle is evaluating whether your results are equitable. So ideally at the beginning of your project, you've defined what that means for your context. There's a lot of different ways to define equitable results. We'll talk about that more in the action step section. But with whatever you've defined, it's really important to come back at the end of your project to that definition, look at the actual results that you got, and compare and assess, was this actually equitable? And if not, what are you going to do about it? So those are our bookends. So next I'm going to turn it over to Daphne to introduce Jessica and the project lifecycle.
Great. Now that we have a better idea of what intersectionality is, we are going to walk through sort of like a persona to help us better understand how the idea of intersectionality can be applied to a data science project lifecycle. So let's meet Jessica. She's been assigned with a project that is going to be the example that we'll be walking through. Jessica is a data scientist working in her first data science role at her very first job out of college. She is a recent graduate living in Los Angeles, is an active member of the Women in Technology group within her company, and enjoys spending time with her friends on weekends, scrolling through Instagram and getting work done at a local coffee shop, pre-COVID, of course. Jessica is a young African-American woman who enjoys working on solving people analytics problems, which is why she decided to take this role in human resources at a Fortune 500 technology company. She knows what intersectionality is, but doesn't quite know how it might be applicable just yet to the work that she's doing. So now we're going to dive into a project that Jessica has been assigned, and we're going to walk through the data science project lifecycle, which some of you guys might be familiar with, and we're going to see how intersectionality can be applied each step of the way. So to illustrate how one might apply an intersectionality lens in his or her data science work, we are going to walk through this project. Something to note here is that we are going to be talking about intersectionality as it relates to all steps of the data science project lifecycle, because intersectionality is something that you incorporate into every single step of the data science process. It is not something you only think about when defining your project, and it is certainly not an afterthought once you've completed your project and realize your algorithm does not represent all identities accurately, at least not the ones that you're trying to target. Applying an intersectionality lens is something that your project should incorporate every step of the way while conducting your research, while checking to see if your results are equitable, etc. And in no way is this strictly applicable to a data science process. Please feel free to implement this framework to any sort of production environment that you're interested in using this in. So for instance, product development or even research and experimentation processes. And this can be applied to a wide range of people problems. You'll see here that this problem that we're presenting to you is very specific to Jessica's job, but again, this is really applicable to any sort of people analytics problem, including development of COVID research, vaccines, even a way to provide greater resources for students. All right, let's move into the first step, which is problem definition. Some of you guys might be aware the first step in starting a data science project is to define your problem and understand what the problem is that you're being faced with. Jessica has been assigned with the task of predicting that female employees have a higher churn rate than their male counterparts within the company. What's wrong with Jessica's problem statement? Well, first of all, this is an example of confirmation bias. The problem is essentially stating or trying to predict the rate of women leaving the company within a specified period of time, and it's predicting that that number will be higher than that of men leaving the company. Jessica has approached the problem with preconceived notions of what her results might be. This is an example of confirmation bias, in which case she isn't looking to discover anything new, she is merely looking to confirm something that she thinks she already knows. Another problem with this statement is that she has reduced the problem down to an issue of gender, when there could in fact be a number of different factors contributing to the likelihood of someone leaving the company within that specified period of time. She's turned this into kind of a men versus women problem, when churn likely has to do with everything from age to sexual orientation to race even. So reframing the problem statement as predicting rate of employee churn for the following year opens up the problem so that Jessica can dig deeper into the real underlying company culture and where gaps may present themselves in the employee experience. Great, so now that Jessica has fixed her problem statement, we can move on to data collection. Now that Jessica has effectively reframed a question, she can go in and collect survey responses and divide them based on gender, age, and race. But what's wrong with Jessica's data collection approach? In splitting the data up into these categories, male versus female, young versus old, Jessica has essentially assumed that those who belong to those categories will have similar experiences within the company. It's important to know that maybe not all women or not all men will have the same experiences within her company. Some of these men and women will belong to multiple identity groups, which I'm sure some of you do. Some of us belong to a number of different identity groups that intersect, all of which face their own set of adversities in the workplace. These adversities are then compounded. They stack on top of each other, meaning the hardships that a Black queer woman in technology may face several times the amount of adversity in comparison to her white male peer in technology. And one way to combat this is to disaggregate your people data when collecting. Disaggregation means breaking down your information into smaller subpopulations. So for instance, what is the racial ethnic breakdown of women within the company? As the experience of a Latina woman may be different from that of a Black woman or an Asian woman. Another example would be a breakdown of age within the male population of the company. How many people belong to each generation within the company? That way, all voices are fairly represented. Not representing specific groups of people, albeit it being more work, means silencing them in your research process. It means declaring their presence and their contributions not worthy of representation in your product, tool, or algorithm. What happens to those people who sit at intersections? This silences groups of people who may already be coming from underrepresented backgrounds. Disaggregating data means providing resources to those who may not have had them otherwise. It also means that Jessica digs deeper into her company's culture, identifying potential gaps that may not have been obvious from the beginning. An example would be if Jessica found out that Asian men who had physical disabilities within the company were more likely to churn within the year, something she never would have known if she had not broken down the male population within the company into smaller subcategories. Again, it'll likely be more work for us as data professionals, but it's a long-term investment into the algorithm and into the livelihood of the company itself, as well as the company culture in this particular use case. Great. Now Jessica can move into data exploration, analysis, and algorithm training. So Jessica is ready to do some data exploration and analysis. She trains her prediction model, which tells her that women are, in fact, more likely to churn than men. So Jessica's ready to present her findings. But is she really? Data science and AI algorithms are, unfortunately, not the cold, hard, programmed machines that we make them out to be. Models are really only as good as the data we train them with, as it eventually becomes an amalgamation of all of the different flaws that presented themselves throughout the data science project design lifecycle. In which case, results produced may not be an accurate reflection of your audience if you knew that somewhere way in the back when you started your data science project, you had recognized that there were biases. In this part of the data science project lifecycle, it is essential to evaluate your results because it takes a good deal of human knowledge to produce equitable results when using data science. For instance, sure, females are more likely to churn within the next year than males, but maybe Latino males who are queer are more likely to churn than women overall within the company, which speaks volumes about the company culture. It's a good idea here to actually bring in someone with a fresh pair of eyes to review your results, potentially a group of people who do reflect the demographic makeup of people within your target audience. If you find that your results are not equitable and do not in fact represent your desired audience, it is imperative that you go back and repeat any additional steps in order to achieve those equitable results, even if it means that you are spending more time on your project. All right. And last but not least, we go into delivery. And this is certainly not least because delivery has a great deal of influence on how your results are perceived. How can Jessica prevent misinterpretation of her findings? Jessica should start off by being transparent about her process, where she got her data from, how she got it, who she surveyed in order to obtain this equitable data. Secondly, Jessica should report all relevant and important findings. Easier said than done. It can be easy at this stage to only present or deliver findings that you have personally found to be intriguing or confirm something that you already knew going into this project. However, it is important to remember that the insights delivered should be insights that ultimately contribute to solving the problem presented at the beginning of the life cycle. Findings presented should be representative of the audience you're seeking to help, as opposed to only presenting the findings that confirm your biases. It's also important to note that sometimes we may subconsciously omit negative outcomes, in which case that's not very good either. It's important to note that whatever outcomes may come out of this project, so long as they contribute to solving the problem you've been presented with, like I'd said earlier, you should deliver that data, because even sometimes the most negative results will contribute the most to solving your problem. All right, now that we've walked through the entire data science project lifecycle, I'm going to pass it back to Rachel, who's going to kick off some action items that we can walk through for you to apply an intersectionality lens in your work with data.
Great. So we've talked about what intersectionality is, and we've talked about why it's so important at each stage of the project lifecycle. So this is where we get into the how and how you can actually apply what we've just talked about to your own work. So we're about to talk about several great resources. We have them all compiled in a one-pager for you. We've got the link on the screen here, and we'll also make sure that we put the link in the chat so you can follow along there. So before we get back to the life cycle, we've got some action items related to those bookends I spoke about earlier. So our first bookend, as you may remember, is deepening awareness. So again, this is self-awareness and going into some unconscious bias training for yourself, for your team, for data teams within your company. So we have two resources for you that we recommend for this stage. The first we have on the slide here, this is an example of an identity wheel. And this is a great exercise that you can do individually. You can do it with your team. It could be a great option to bring in an external facilitator to guide the conversation with your team. And you can go through and get a better and deeper understanding of your own identity. You can reflect on the identities that are represented among your data science team. And you can start to think through where unconscious bias may arise. And the second resource that we recommend is, of course, unconscious bias training. So this is a great opportunity to get some real tools that you can use to identify and address unconscious bias as it arises in your data science process. If you work at a large company, your company may already have some programming in place for this that you can seek out. There's also lots of facilitators and other resources that are great options for exploring this with your team. So this is our first bookend before the process. Our second bookend here is about unpacking assumptions. So this is where you're really looking to document and challenge those assumptions that are arising as you're formulating your project. So we have two frameworks in our guide for you to unpack these assumptions. The first is called the 5 whys. You may have heard of this as a problem-solving framework, and it's great for that. It's also great for unpacking assumptions. So the way that it works is you take an assumption that has come up in your project, you ask why that assumption is being made, and you get an answer. And then you ask why underneath that answer. So you go down a few layers deep under each assumption to really understand what the driver is. We've got a second framework for you called the curiosity mindset, also linked on our guide. And that's another tool that you can use to validate. So once you've gotten a few layers deep on those assumptions, that gives you a great approach to really ask, is there data supporting this assumption? Where did it come from? And if we don't know, how can we validate it, or how can we remove it from our project so that it's not affecting our results?
All right, so the next action item is to design effectively, which we had kind of touched upon in Jessica's project lifecycle. We had talked about approaching your projects objectively and to eliminate any confirmation biases from your problem statements. However, that can sometimes be difficult when you don't even realize what your biases are when approaching a project as a data professional. It can be helpful here to maybe bring in someone from outside of your organization to give you a fresh pair of eyes on your presentation. Either other data scientists or even a group of people who may be representative of the audience you are targeting. The next action item is to collect equitably, which speaks to the point we had suggested earlier in the presentation, which was to disaggregate your data when collecting data on people. Break down your data into smaller subpopulations so that you reach even those who are sitting at intersections of various identities. This may take a little bit more time, but breaking down your data in this way can actually uncover greater insight than if you were to look at general categories. And the next action step is to analyze with care, which is referring to the analysis portion of your typical data science project lifecycle. It's critical here to ask effective questions with regards to intersectional groups. One exercise I'd recommend is to actually go through the data you just collected with a series of different lenses. So it's almost like trying on a ton of different hats. Does both age and gender affect the responses in this survey? How might survey responses differ between ethnic groups within each gender? Posing questions with an intersectional lens also means that you're uncovering more insight than you would have without it. If you find that a particular group of people in your target audience is missing from your data, revisit any previous steps in your life cycle to ensure that these people are represented properly.
And finally, we've got present objectively. So when you're at the presentation stage, as we talked about with Jessica's project, it's really important that you be clear about your data sources. So really specific about where you got your data and how your data can be interpreted. So for example, if you only collected data within your company, then the findings from your project are probably only applicable to your own company. They maybe can't be generalized to the whole industry or to another company because of the limitations with your data source. The other thing you want to keep in mind here is presenting any limitations. So maybe you found in disaggregating your data that there were some subgroups that weren't represented at all in your sample, and maybe you weren't able to rectify that in your process. That's something that's really important to highlight because that alone may be a finding in and of itself. So after presentation, we've got our final bookend here, which is evaluating your results. So again, you've hopefully defined what an equitable result looks like at the beginning of your project so that you have it to refer back to. We've got a link on our resource guide for some different ways you can do this. It depends on your context. It might be something like parity between different groups that you're looking at, or it could be you're trying to match your audience to the community in which your company is located. So there's a few different ways that can look. But based on whatever that definition is, you've gone back at this phase, you're looking at how equitable your results actually turned out to be. And if they weren't equitable, you're planning your next steps. Maybe you're revisiting this project or you're starting a new project to really dig into that equity issue that you've identified. So that concludes our presentation. We hope you found some helpful tools to apply an intersectionality lens to your work. If you haven't already gotten the one-pager, we've got the link here again, so make sure that you grab that for some great resources. And we would love to take any questions.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rachel and Daphne. Let me see if there's any questions. So far, no. I have a sort of related question. As a lot of companies are starting a inclusion D&I department, diversion and inclusion, which is at the hiring level before they even can churn. Like, how would you think about giving everyone an equitable evaluation before they even get hired, like at the interview process? Have you have any experience with that?
It's a great question. Daphne, do you want to start?
I have not personally been on the hiring end, unfortunately, but I know that this was a question that, or the project, the scenario that I came up with for Jessica was actually something that we were asking ourselves at Disney is, can we predict churn? And I'm sure every HR department now is asking this question, right? Can we predict churn based on a series of data points? And Annie, were you referring to more so like, can you, I guess, not so much classify, but calculate the, I guess, the equity before you even hire someone? Or is that what you were referring to?
Right. So I think a lot of times the interview process is very skewed towards a certain demographics. And so like, for example, pair coding, that may not be the most best way to evaluate someone if someone don't have that pair coding skills, which kind of comes with like, doing a lot of coding with, in a university setting perhaps. And if someone was self-taught, they might not be able to do that as well. And, that's kind of like one of many examples that I have, seen in my hiring on both sides of the desk.
Sure. I guess, so what is it that you would like to achieve or see in this process of asking this question? And maybe I can
So
give you
usually I think there's only one hiring process, right? Which is set up by the hiring manager along with the
Gotcha.
recruiter. There is no different kind of process for the same position. Like if you are, self-taught, maybe you should do it one way. If you are from a university and have a computer science degree, you do another way or something like that. But it's always the same way. And so
Gotcha.
it's the super high bar that you have to jump over in order to get through the gatekeepers to get into the company that you really want to work in.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think that's really interesting because I definitely don't come from a technical background. And I think that that is a challenge that a lot of new tech companies are facing and that a lot of people are becoming self-taught, right? Yeah, one interesting way that I have wanted to address, not this problem in particular, but another where we're trying to classify project management types of projects essentially, and how we can address each problem differently, but still in somewhat of a structured way. One way is to bucket out the different, I guess, segments of people that you expect to come through for a particular application, and then come up with maybe not a different process, but a different set of questions or criteria for each level of programming experience that you're looking for. At least from my experience, that's how I've approached a problem like that, come up with different criteria based on the problem that I'm facing. So maybe that's something you can look into, come up with a different set of questions or criteria based on the level of experience that you're expecting. Maybe at the end of the day, you are a company that you're on the hiring end where you're looking for some people who are self-taught, some people who aren't, and you're completely okay with that, then yes, certainly come up with a different process for those different types of people.
Yeah, and I think what you're getting at, Annie, is exactly the unpacking assumptions piece that we got to, right? So if your hiring process has a built-in assumption that everyone's going to be great at pair coding, and that's going to be a great way to showcase everyone's skills, that's a great assumption to question. And yeah, that might not be equitable if that is favoring folks who have a university education over a different form. So I think that's absolutely the right question to be asking, and it's going to depend on the context. But that's exactly what we're getting at. So I'm glad you asked that.
Great.
We did actually get a question. It looks like 2 new questions. Let's see.
Oh, yes.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I'll read that out. The source data itself can be biased, and then that the data can cause bias in the data science algorithm as well. So how do you manage this data and or algorithm bias?
Great question. I can start for this one. So I think the key for this is, as we talked about, really understanding where your data is coming from and understanding those assumptions that are built into it. And so if you're finding that there's so many assumptions built into this data source that any results you get from it are going to be pretty biased, maybe that's a good time to collect different data. I mean, I think it's what we're talking about is applying a really critical lens at each phase of this. And so if you're noticing that at the beginning, that's going to affect your results. So I think that's, this is where we were saying, it might take longer. It might be harder to go back and figure out a way to complete your data set or collect a different data set. But sometimes that's what you have to do in order to get to equitable results.
Yeah, so many thoughts because of this question, just because this is something that I deal with on a daily basis as a data scientist, right? Is my data set even good enough for me? Is it even, clean? And obviously, no data scientist is getting a perfectly clean and unbiased data set ever, because that would be the dream. But a couple of things here that come to mind is A, consider a couple of different data sets if that is an option. In many cases, that is not an option. And then B, also consider the context in which your data was collected from. So in my research and learning about intersectionality and how it applies to data and all that good stuff, I'd learned a lot about first understanding the context of where your data comes from, who collected it, maybe what were the circumstances under which it was collected from. And then if that doesn't really align with what you're looking for, then move on, because that's a sign that your data set is likely not going to be on par with what you're trying to produce as a data professional.
Okay, and then the next question is, the source itself can be biased, and then, oh, sorry, wrong one. It seems like the level of honesty of question of the person is also a factor. What would you suggest as a good step in self-reflection to get objectivity?
That is a great question. So I think this is maybe coming in where we were talking about doing that self-awareness step and thinking about unconscious bias and your own identity reflection. So this is where I think a great option is to bring in an external facilitator, either to your team or to maybe work with individually before you bring in your team if you're a team leader, because that can really provide someone to kind of mirror back to you the analysis that you're doing, take you through not just the identity wheel exercise we showed, but there's other exercises you can do with your team that can be really illuminating in terms of bringing out different identity aspects, how that is affecting you, level of privilege in certain areas. So I think there's lots of great tools. And if you're thinking that an additional kind of source of objectivity would be helpful for you, my recommendation would be seeking out a facilitator to help kind of guide that conversation.
And if you notice yourself going into something already with these preconceived notions, which is totally natural, right? You get presented with a problem statement, a question from your boss, whoever, or you maybe think of something on your own when you're trying to figure out what the next data science initiative is that you're trying to pursue. It's easy to have assumptions as human beings. And usually what I'll do before I start each data science process is I'll write down my assumptions. And I'll typically include that in my presentation as well. At the end of the process of the entire data science project, I'll typically present some of the assumptions I had going into the project, because it's important to note the contrast between what you found and your assumptions, and realizing that maybe something you thought was right was actually wrong. But it just proves that you went in with an objective mind. It helps to write everything down and then to challenge those assumptions.
Yeah, and also kind of adding from my own experience, a friend of mine works at a tech company, and she got a report from HR that they have now gone their gender parity, 50% women, 50% male. And then she goes, wait a minute, this is entire company. I'm talking about gender parity in the tech area, all the engineers, all the infrastructure people. And in that section where she works specifically, it was less than 5%. So
yeah, that's absolutely an example of intersectionality, right? Because you're comparing the smaller subcategory within the company with the company overall, and it totally is not the same. So there's definitely still inequities there. But you never would have thought that, right, if no one had investigated, hey, the technology side of the company actually only has 5% women.
Right. And imagine if you add other identity layers in there. I mean, the picture probably does not improve with that. So yeah, definitely good to break it down.
Always challenge the report that you get from various folks to kind of, where did your data come from? What are you trying to get at? Because as part of the D&I initiative, they say, hey, there's nothing for us to do. We're at parity. Well, great. Let me see if there's any more questions. Okay, I think we finished all the questions. So thank you, Rachel and Daphne, for your presentation. Appreciate all the attendees for the questions and interactions during the session. Please provide your feedback and comments to us, to the organizer at the community board. We appreciate all comments. And also thank you for joining today's presentation. I hope you can gain some insights from this session. So have a wonderful day, and thank you for being a part of this year's DataCon LA.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.